Well, welcome. We are so pleased to have you joining us today. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the Executive Director of the SEEP Network, and we are pleased to be partnering with the Church Investment Group and Joanne Hansen from CIG to present this workshop. And we think that it's on a really interesting topic and a new way of thinking about climate change and sustainability. And I'm not going to say anything else other than that as you come into the room, we will be promoting you so that you are visible and can ask questions live. What we would ask is that you go on mute unless you're going to ask a question. You can also enter your questions into the chat feature. So without any more ado, I'm going to hand it over to Joanne. And thank you for suggesting this and for joining us and hosting it, Joanne.
Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Joanne Hansen, and I'm the president of the Church Investment Group. And it's my pleasure today to introduce you to Professor Jason Jay and Pedro de Vasconcelos Oporto from the MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative. And they are also joined by Bethany Payton, who's the head of the Climate Pathways Project. And Jason and his team have built a model which will enable us today to explore which solutions to climate transitions are effective and how effective are they. Climate is a central theme for the Church Investment Group. We're a nonprofit for Episcopal endowments with three primary missions. One is to protect capital and generate returns through full-time investment management using an outsourced chief investment officer. The second is implementing environmental, social, and governance, ESG as it's called, approaches to investment. And lastly, engaging in advocacy through proxy voting and through being members of organizations like the UN Principles for Responsible Investing, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, known as ICCR, and the Intentional Endowment Network. As Episcopal endowments think about and assess their investments, taking climate change into consideration is really essential. Companies that have strong resource policies now and are planning for the future are better positioned for strong investment returns. So Joe mentioned in terms of logistics, we're all going to be participants so that there's a chance to ask questions and interact. In the meantime, I would ask everyone to stay on mute. Please feel free to turn your video on so that Jason and Pedro can see you and take questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason to further introduce himself, Pedro, and tell us about the En-ROADS model.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having us, Joanne and Joe. I'm really excited to be here. And as you'll see, we're kind of converting this on the fly from more of a webinar passive format to this upgrading everybody to be panelists so that I can see everyone. I've got three screens here, one of them where I can see everyone's faces. So that helps me so I know when I've put you to sleep and when I can wake you up. And so I'd love to have videos on if you're in a place where you're comfortable and have the bandwidth to do that. As Joanne said, I teach at the MIT Sloan School of Management. I'm the director of the Sustainability Initiative there. Pedro Oporto is my research assistant on this project. We're part of a much larger team called the Climate Pathways Project, which is a collaboration between the MIT Sloan School of Management and Climate Interactive to develop these interactive simulation tools based on the best available science to help people explore and understand the dynamics of climate change and what actions are going to take us to a safer climate future. And so we're going to do an interactive workshop with you using this tool set, and you're going to get to have the same experience that we do with senators, congresspeople, heads of investment organizations, C-suite executives of companies, and leaders around the world. So really excited to have you all here and to dig in on this. And then as Joanne mentioned, Bethany Payton is also here. She is the director of that Climate Pathways Project and co-director of the Sustainability Initiative with me, and has led our work with elected officials and policymakers, while Pedro and I are focused on understanding investor journeys on climate change. I'm going to share my screen here so we can dig in. Now, this is part of a research project which is aiming to understand, in part, the efficacy of this tool set and in driving action and greater understanding on climate change. So part of that research is that we always like to do a lot of data gathering. And so the first thing I would love for you to do is to do a very short pre-session survey. And this is what you can do is if you take your phone and you just open the camera and point the camera at this QR code, you'll get a little thing pop at the top of the screen. You tap it, and that'll take you to our little survey. It's only a couple of questions, and it's a way to gather some quick insights about your perspective on climate change. And I'll just take a quiet moment here for you to do this and start to get these wheels turning. Pedro is also pasting the link in the chat, in case that's easier for you. Okay, wave at me if you feel like you need a little bit more time. Okay, no problem, no problem. Take a moment. Okay, it looks like people are freeing up their attention. So I'm gonna start digging in. Really appreciate you doing that pre-survey. It's fantastically important for us as we learn and evolve our efforts here. So first of all, let's start with what problem we're trying to solve today. And that problem is the challenge of decarbonizing our economy in order to protect from the worst consequences of climate change. This is a picture of where on the y-axis we have global greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the amount of CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, other greenhouse gases that we're pushing into the atmosphere every year. If we think about the atmosphere as like a bathtub or a kitchen sink, the faucet is the emissions pouring into that bathtub. And those emissions are increasing every year. So we're turning on the faucet with greater and greater vigor every year. And in a business as usual scenario, if we keep going the way we're going and emissions continue to increase with the growth of our global industrial system, the scientists estimate that we'll be in a future of 3.6 degrees Celsius or 6.5 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial temperatures. So before we started warming up the planet by burning fossil fuels, relative to now, it's a 3.6 degree world, warmer world. And what the scientists tell us is that to avoid the worst consequences of climate change, we need to create a much different climate future, one that's only 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And that means a dramatic reduction of greenhouse gas emissions over the course of the next couple of decades. Why is this an important problem to solve? Well, the risks of a 3.6 degree world are very significant. This is a picture that comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their last report, looking at how risks that we face in climate change correlate to the temperature. So you are here. We have already warmed the planet about 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And if we go to that business as usual future of 3.6 degrees or higher, we enter into a zone which is colored purple on this graph, which means very high risks of severe irreversible impacts with limited ability to adapt. Scientists, you know, as a crowd, as a culture, don't like to use words like catastrophic, but this is about as close as they come. And this is in areas like dryland water scarcity, the kinds of droughts that we've seen in Chennai, India, southern Brazil, South Africa, parts of the United States, soil erosion, vegetation loss, tropical crop yield declines, which can affect the global food system, wildfire damage, which we've seen in California, Australia, and other parts of the world. We're already seeing some of these impacts already, which is this yellow zone, but this default climate future is a much more dangerous world. And so you can see that if we can create a 1.5 degree world, we're still going to be facing risks that we have to adapt to, but we're going to be avoiding the worst consequences of climate change. So that's the problem we have to solve. And even further to that, I'll just add one more layer to this problem, which is that we have one facet of the solution, which is that there is a global agreement, the Paris Accord, of countries coming together and saying, this is a problem. In principle, we want to change the future so that we can have a 2 degree or 1.5 degree world. But if you look at the nationally determined contributions, the commitments by countries about what they actually have plans to do, and you add up the emissions reductions, it only leads to a 3.3 degree world. So in some way, we need to very significantly change this trajectory. Now the question is, well, how do we do that? And how do we literally on this call in this room do that? And how do we engage each other and our wider communities to do so? Well, the first thing, especially for us and coming from a research institution like MIT, is to understand that, as our colleague John Sturman is fond of pointing out, the research shows that showing people research doesn't work. In other words, I can show you a lot of graphs and PowerPoints, and it's not necessarily going to engage you, help you really understand what's going to make a difference, or mobilize you to take action. And the whole point of the research that we're doing here is to understand, well, what really does engage people? And what it appears is that when people have a chance to learn for themselves how this science works, how the technology and the economics of this works, then it is a much better starting point for real engagement and action on climate change. And so our team has developed a set of tools to support this, which are rapid overview and decision support tools. That's what ROAD stands for. And there's a climate one and an energy system one. And we're going to be playing with the En-ROADS tool today, which will allow us to rapidly and continuously try out our ideas and understanding and really experiment together. You're going to put your hands on this thing. This was developed in tandem between, as I said, MIT, Climate Interactive, University of Massachusetts Lowell has been developing the pre-post protocols. You saw their logo on that survey that you did. And we're drawing on data and research from a huge variety of sources, consensus science, essentially from International Energy Agency, the IPCC, and beyond. These models are free, accessible to anybody with a web browser. We're going to put the URL in chat later. They're transparent, open source. You can look at all of the assumptions and play with them yourself. And they're calibrated and tested to behave the same as the big supercomputer models. And so they've been scientifically, in a sense, validated, but they are aggregated to be fast, meaning that we're going to play with changing the whole world at a time. And then the computer doesn't have to calculate what's happening at every single neighborhood. And as a result, we can really experiment and play with it interactively. And that interactivity allows us to go and engage with senators, congresspeople, people in the Biden administration. As I mentioned, Bethany is leading the charge on this on this elected officials engagement. We have written endorsements on this from people like John Kerry and Sheldon Whitehouse, including Republicans like John Curtis. And then Pedro and I have been leading efforts to engage the investor community. And so we have some similar thoughts here from a venture capital fund, from a larger asset manager, about how this can develop some insights about evidence-based climate action for investors. And we've been doing a number of these workshops, and we're really grateful that we've been able to come here to be part of this conversation. But you may not be involved in the investment world. We totally understand that. This is a great mixed group from across the Episcopal community. We also do workshops like this with middle school kids, high school kids, church groups, community groups, nonprofit organizations of all kinds. And we train people to be ambassadors so that you can do what I'm doing today. And we'll talk more about that later. But we're going to dig right in and get our hands on this tool. So the question we're going to ask ourselves is, what actions will help us to limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees? And the first thing I want to do is just ask you that question as a kind of open-ended question, just to understand what are your sort of preconceptions or understanding of what will help us solve climate change. What I'm using here is a polling tool. On the top of the screen, you'll see this URL, polev.com/JasonJ. Pedro will also paste this in the chat. You can open this in a separate browser tab from your Zoom, or you can open it up on your phone so that you have it available to you. I'll ask a couple of questions throughout this meeting. And when you type in an answer, it will be anonymous and it will show up on the screen for us all to see. So this will be a way, since we've got about, looks like 30 or so people here, this will be a way for us to get a bunch of input quickly from the group. And so go to this URL, polev.com/JasonJ. I'm just gonna, there we go, great. Peter just put it in, so it's clickable. And then just what action do you think is gonna help us solve climate change? What is gonna make a difference on this big, challenging global issue? Okay, scope 3 emissions as a KPI in the supply chain or organizations. Okay, so somebody here has been doing their climate homework. So what does that mean? That means when we're looking at companies and how they're buying things, making sure that we're looking at the embodied carbon in the things that we're buying. Excellent. Renewable energy, a price on carbon, a carbon tax, legislation to deal with this issue in a variety of ways, perhaps. Deal with carbon. End the use of fossil fuels, lower carbon usage. Excellent. So let's keep these ideas coming. What are the things, what are the technologies, the policies, the actions at different scales that are going to help us to solve climate change? Let's get more of these out on the table. Get people reconnected with nature, change the attitudes of consumers and politicians toward environmental protection and GHG reduction. Sequestering carbon in the soil, excellent. So regenerative agriculture practices, plant trees. So one of the things I want to point out here as this picture starts to come together, and I encourage you to continue bringing these out. I'm just going to make these a little smaller so we can see more of them at a time. Wind farms, is that imagine that you are a politician, an elected official, and you are trying to think about how we're going to solve climate change, or you are the head of a major investment endowment or other asset owner, and you're trying to think about how to go about trying to solve climate change. What you're hearing here is a variety of different ideas, but you don't have very much bandwidth to think about it, right? As an elected official, you have this much attention, and you have to think about, how we're managing the coronavirus pandemic, national security issues, voting rights issues, racial justice issues, and economic issues, inflation. And then you've got about this much time to think about the environment. And then within environment, you've got some water, air pollution issues. So you've got about this much time to think about climate. And within that window of attention, I hear this huge variety of different possible ways that we could try to tackle climate change, from red meat to wind farms to renewable energy to carbon tax. And it's very hard. They all sound about the same. Let's do one thing, check the box, and move on to the next issue. So the point of the exercise here is to really get present to, well, how are these things different from each other? How do they relate to each other? And what are the impacts of all of these different efforts? So let's start to play with that using our simulation tool. So this is the En-ROAD simulation tool. Again, it's available for use on the web. We'll put the link in later. We can look at a variety of different graphs. So we can look at all kinds of economic indicators, environmental indicators, energy indicators that you have questions about, and we're happy to bring those up. These are the two graphs that I like to start with, which is that we've got, on the left is the stack of how we're making our energy globally. So this is a global model, so it's in the whole planet here, the whole world. And we've got the energy from coal, from oil, from natural gas, from renewable energy, which includes solar, wind, geothermal, and hydropower, our biofuels, and our nuclear energy. And then from that picture, we go to our greenhouse gas emissions. So this dark gray band is the greenhouse gas emissions from energy. So all of this stuff is, all this coal, oil, and gas is emitting these greenhouse gases. But greenhouse gases also come from land use change, so deforestation, and from methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases, all of which have a very strong effect on the climate. In fact, but are put into this picture in CO2 equivalent terms, so that methane already has 30 to 40 times the effect of CO2. Down at the bottom here, we have a whole array of different levers that we can pull, different climate actions that we can try and to see how they have an impact. When we pull a slider here, what that means is it's like the whole world is coordinating to make that kind of investment, and we can see what the results are for the climate. So in your poll, we had a couple people say renewable energy, wind farms. Let's start with that, and we can look at renewable energy. So there are detailed settings in this where I can go into greater detail and timing of the policy. But just at a simple level, if I pull this slider over, what it's going to do is it's going to increase our subsidy or our encouragement of renewable energy. At a community level, you could think about it as going out and knocking on doors and getting people to solarize Massachusetts or what state you live in. At a policy level, it could be a feed-in tariff or a renewable portfolio standard. So this is a way of, or at a corporate level, it could be Google committing to 100% renewable energy. Or at an investor level, having a strategy to buy green bonds or other project finance mechanisms that will help to do renewable energy. So I'm going to pull this slider, and I want you to first form a hypothesis. What is going to happen if we make a pretty sizable increase in renewable energy subsidies all around the world? What's going to happen to the left graph? What's going to happen to the right graph? And what's going to happen to the global temperature? So when I pull this lever here, you just in fact, just choose a number in your mind of what you think the temperature will be in the future if we can significantly ramp up renewable energy. And I'm going to go ahead and do it. Okay, so real time, we could see how this impacts the world. And what I can do is I can kind of undo and redo these changes so that you can see the contrast. What you see is this green band of renewable energy is expanding. As a result of it expanding, it is substituting away for some of the coal, oil, and gas. And as a result of that, the greenhouse gas emissions on the right are going down. And as a result of that, we're getting 1/10 of a degree less warming than we would have without that intervention. Now, you can just wave at me with your hands in the video. Raise your hand if that was a smaller change than you thought it was going to be. Okay. Almost everybody raised your hand. I had the exact same. Raise your hand if this was about what you expected it to be. Raise your hand if it was less than if it was actually a bigger change than you thought it was going to be. Okay, so the center of gravity in this group, everyone who raised their hand said that this was a smaller change than you thought it would be, and I've had the same reaction. Many people have a similar reaction to this picture. Now we have significantly ramped up our renewable energy production. So we're doing, this is measured in exajoules per year, which is this kind of mind-boggling quantity of energy because we're talking about a global model. But we've gone from a future of 272 to 391. So it's a very significant ramp up of renewable energy relative to what it would have been. It's a 2 cent per kilowatt hour subsidy. We could ramp that up even more if we wanted to, and maybe go to 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And that would buy ourselves an additional 1/10 of a degree, but oftentimes that's still not as big of a change as people might think. So I'd love to hear from the audience. You can just raise your hand by clicking the reaction button and clicking raise hand. What's going on here? Why is this not having more of an effect? Why is this having a less of an impact on the climate than we might have expected? Any guesses? Joanne Ward, go ahead. You'll have to unmute.
Yeah, finding it. I think we're still using too much energy.
Okay, great. We're still using too much energy. So the overall height of this mountain is still continuing to increase. In fact, if you look closely at the top of the mountain here, the total energy use is actually going up slightly when we do this, because by subsidizing energy, we're making it cheaper. We're subsidizing renewable energy, but we're still making energy cheaper overall, so people are using more of it. And that's certainly a factor. And so as a result, while we're ramping up, while some of that renewables is substituting away for fossil, some of it is just increasing overall energy usage. So that's certainly part of the picture. Any other comments on this or explanations for what we're seeing? Claire, go ahead.
Could it be because our population continues to grow?
Okay, population, absolutely. So one of these fundamental drivers here is that population is growing. Now it is leveling out. This our base case model here is what's called the UN median forecast for population, which is that population kind of levels out at 10.8 billion by the end of the century. Now, right now we're getting close to 8 billion. We're about 7.8. And so, yes, population does continue to increase. Economic growth also continues to increase. So we've got, a long-term economic growth of about 2.5% per year of gross world product, following historical trends here. And so, I think your intuition is this picture, which is what's called the Kaya identity, which is we have the population times the GDP per capita gives us the total economic output. We multiply that by the energy intensity of GDP. So we might be getting more energy efficient as we develop our technology. But your point is that global population and GDP are still continuing to grow. And that's what's continuing to drive the growth of our energy use and our emissions. By subsidizing renewables, we've decreased the carbon intensity of that final energy. But this number is being multiplied by these two numbers, and that's part of the picture. Absolutely, yeah. So this is great. So I love the engagement, and I love the getting the thinking process going here. So we've tried renewable energy. Let's look at something. Let's look at some other ideas. Now, so let's go to one of the other ideas we've got on here. Somebody said. Sequestering carbon in soil. So let's, and there's cut red meat, grow food locally. So there's a lot of interest in the food system. So let's talk about some things that we can do playing with agricultural levers in this picture. There's a couple places where we can do this in the model. One is that this idea of putting carbon in the soil is a kind of carbon removal approach, or carbon removal technology. So we've got all the carbon removal stuff is over here. And underneath technological carbon removal, we have the various techniques that we can use to remove carbon from the atmosphere. This includes setting up bioenergy plants where we grow biomass, burn it, and then grab this, the carbon and put it down into the soil, or put it down into geological formations. direct air capture, which is sort of vacuum cleaners that suck in the air and filter out the CO2, enhanced mineralization, which is laying rocks out in the soil that absorb CO2. And then this is the one we were looking for, which is agricultural soil carbon sequestration. So these are techniques like no-till agriculture, techniques like cover cropping, crop rotation, and other techniques which leave the carbon in the soil, particular species of crops which tend to grow larger root growth and sequester carbon in the soil. The scientists estimate that there's a technical potential, a maximum technical potential for how much carbon we can put in our soils. And so this is just, when I pull this lever, it's going to be us exploiting some percentage of that potential. So let's say that we convert 50% of the farms in the farmland in the world to these regenerative agriculture practices, which would be an incredibly ambitious global effort to do essentially global carbon farming. And so I'm going to click that 50%. And again, I want you to form a hypothesis of what's going to happen to our graphs and our carbon number when I do that. Let me make this a nice round 50%. And so that just got us another 1/10 of a degree Celsius. What you can see here on this, the way to see this on this picture is that on the upper right graph here, we've got a gray band of negative emissions, which is starting to appear here, which is us removing carbon. So it's below the 0 line. We're removing carbon from the atmosphere to the tune of about 2.1 gigatons of CO2 every year. That's a tremendous 2.1 billion tons of CO2 every year going into our soils. That's fantastic. That's a big number, but it is a small number relative to the size of our emissions. So we're putting away 2 gigatons a year. So that's like the drain in that sink or bathtub of the atmosphere. We're opening up a drain, pulling some carbon into the soil, but we're pulling 2 while we're emitting 44 from our energy system, another 11 in methane. And so our emissions just massively dwarf the removals that we are doing through that soil carbon sequestration. Now, there's a lot of other good reasons to do this. And so I don't want to ignore what are called co-benefits or multi-solving, which is the ability to achieve other environmental and social and economic objectives. Soils with greater carbon also tend to be more they tend to retain water better. They're more resilient to weather changes. There can be greater productivity for the farmers. There's good reasons to do this, but it's only going to get us another 1/10 of a degree of cooling. The other food system levers that were discussed had to do with eating less red meat. Why might we want to eat less red meat? Why does that show up in a climate discussion? Someone want to field that?
Reduces methane.
Okay, reduces methane. Okay, so cows belch methane at a higher level than other species because of the enteric fermentation. So if I click on methane, we can separate out the energy and industry methane from the agricultural methane. And so what we can do is work toward, let's say, a 50% reduction in agricultural methane. And that's going to be a combination of eating less red meat, reducing food waste, particularly in the meat space. Also, there's some new technologies for feeding cows seaweed and other things which will reduce methane production. So let's do a 50% reduction in the agricultural side of the methane picture. And let's see what that does. So that's going to get us another 1/10 of a degree. Now, I want to just pause for a second and acknowledge the emotional experience of what I'm doing here, which is that you may be fueling up some hope, and then I click the button and you're seeing less of a change than you wanted to, and it's like, oh God, is it really going to be this hard? I want to invite you into another emotional experience, which is every 1/10 of a degree matters. So every time we see another 1/10 of a degree come off the board, I want to hear like hoots and hollers and claps and cheers, okay? Because that's what it means to start creating a better future. But what we've done is we've just knocked another 1/10. We've reduced some of these non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions. We can see this on the upper right graph as a shrinking of this light blue band of methane. And again, that is worth some additional cooling. And I should say that if we're reducing that beef consumption, the other aspect about cow cultivation is that they're a very hungry species in terms of the amount of overall plant-based calories that have to go into making 1 calorie of beef. And so the extent of land, water, fertilizer, everything else that's involved is also going to be decreased if we do that. And in particular, we're going to put a little bit less pressure on forests. So I'm going to give a sort of freebie here where we're going to reduce deforestation a little bit to the extent that our fewer cows are putting a little bit less pressure on our Amazon forests. So I'm going to reduce deforestation here, and we'll see what that does. And that itself is going to be worth another 1/10 of a degree. So in that landscape of a shift in diets, now we've kind of got 2/10 of a degree there. And what you can see is that this land use change, which was this green band of emissions, is declining now, so that it's not as much of an issue in the last part of the century, because we're starting to protect those forests. And there's a lot of other good reasons to do that from a biodiversity standpoint. Okay, so now you've started to get a feel for how this tool works. What I'm going to let you do is, in a sense, give a tap onto the tool itself. So I'm going to go back to our Poll Everywhere poll. And again, the URL here is the same one as before. It should automatically refresh on that browser tab, pollev.com/JasonJ. And now what you'll have on your polling tool is this picture of all the different levers available for tackling climate change. If you tap somewhere on here as if you were pulling the lever, it will record a little marker to let me know that this is something that you want to try. So somebody just said, hey, let's try a carbon price. And this number ticked up 1, meaning that one of you have voted for carbon price. So in a sense, I'm just getting a vote from all of you about how we're going to play with this. We've got someone wanting to electrify transport. They want Teslas for everyone. We've got someone who wants a carbon tax of some kind. Someone wants to tax coal or reduce our coal usage in some way. Electrify buildings and industry. So put an air source heat pump on my house. Let's keep these coming in. I'd love to see 30 total. I'd love to see 30 answers on here so I can get a feel for what people are really interested in seeing happen and what you think is going to make a difference in this journey to 2 degrees. Okay, we've got someone on further deforestation, a couple on electrification. All right, 3 more on carbon price. Some people really trying to attack coal. Excellent. So keep these coming in. I'm going to keep this poll open, and you can tap on these as we go, as you have other thoughts and other ideas. But let's start trying some of the things that people have added onto the picture here. So let's start with carbon price, since we've got two people who have suggested doing that. So carbon pricing is, right now, it is free to pollute in the atmosphere. You can put carbon in the atmosphere and no one's going to charge you any money for it. A carbon price makes polluters pay for their emissions, and it can show up in a couple of different ways. Here in New England, where we live, we have the Northeast, which is in the Northeast, we have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. The power plants have to buy permits in order to be able to pollute CO2. And that those permits become fewer and fewer each year. And as a result, they can buy and sell those permits to each other, and that puts a price on carbon. California, through its legislation, has a similar cap and trade style mechanism. China just opened up a carbon market. So it can look like a carbon cap and trade. In British Columbia, they opted for more of a carbon tax, which is where we're just sort of paying a certain dollar per ton of CO2. So what we can do here is we can play with a carbon price. Right now, the price of the carbon trading system in the European Union has gotten us up to $50 a ton. So what would happen if everywhere in the world we were pricing carbon at about $50 a ton? So I'm going to put a $50 price on carbon. When I press enter on my computer, we're going to see what that does to the global emissions picture. And so again, you can form a hypothesis about what that's going to look like. Okay, so that move got us 0.3 of a degree. So all the other levers up to this point gave us 1/10. That gave us 0.3. And let's look at how it operated. So first of all, we see this decrease in coal, particularly because that's our most carbon intensive fuel. And so we've got some substitution away from coal. We're seeing natural gas decline a bit. We're seeing oil decline a little bit, but not that much, because people's use of oil is actually quite, we're sort of locked into that in our transportation system. So it's less elastic to changes in price. And we're seeing an increase in the amount of renewable energy because that is favored. And then you'll see that the overall height of the mountain is decreasing. We're using overall less energy because in the end, energy has become a little more expensive. And so that's incentivized us to move toward more energy efficient light bulbs and other technologies, as well as small changes in behavior like working from home a couple days or shifting from car to train or other shifts like that. So because it induces both reductions in energy consumption as well as decarbonization of the energy supply, it has a larger effect because it's working on multiple channels at the same time. Also, something I should point out is that this is the first thing we've done that has really decreased our coal usage. That has another very important effect. So we're looking mostly at greenhouse gases right now. If we look at air pollution, which is so PM 2.5, which is the size of particle that causes the respiratory and cardiovascular conditions. About 2 million people die every year just in India and China from air pollution. If we do this $50 carbon price, what happens is that by reducing coal use, we have a very significant effect on that PM 2.5 air pollution. So we're the health effects, the asthma, the childhood asthma, and all the rest are very significantly decreased by that policy. And that itself, in some analyses, will pay for the carbon price in terms of the overall cost to society. Now, we could ramp up to a more ambitious carbon price. So one thing we could do is start with a $50 price and then start working toward a higher price, like get towards $100 a ton, but just give us some more time to ramp up to that. So if it took us 10 years to get to a $50 price, and then in 2030, we start continuing to ramp up and get ourselves to a $100 carbon price, we're giving ourselves 20 years to adapt, but that change is worth another 0.2 of a degree. So the higher carbon prices do have effects. There's diminishing effect at some point, but that does turn out to be an important lever in this overall system. There's some great questions coming up in the chat, and I really appreciate Bethany fielding these on my behalf. So
I didn't get to Elizabeth's question though about pulling all of the levers because I can't do that.
Okay, great. So Elizabeth, that's a great point. What happens if we pull all the levers by 10 or 20%? I think that is what will have happened by the time we've clicked through all the different ideas that are on here. But let's make sure to come back to that and try things that we haven't tried at the end. So let's go to the next. A couple of the first that started popping up here were electrification. So this idea of electrify everything is a really interesting idea. It basically means in situations where we're directly burning fossil fuels, like in the tailpipe of my car, or out of the chimney of my house where I'm burning gas in my basement to heat my house, let's see if we can get those things toward electricity. So electrification of transport is going to look like people getting into electric cars, but also electric buses and electric trains and moving into those electrified modalities. So I'm gonna accelerate the amount. And what we'll do is we'll look at the. This is a picture right now of building and industry use of fuel, buildings and industry use of electricity. transportation use of fuel and transportation use of electricity. That's this lower right graph here. So if we accelerate the electrification of transport, let's see what that does. So what that's done is so I'm going to rewind that. On this lower right graph, we're moving from fuel to electrification of transport. In our upper left graph, what you see is that this is the first thing we've done that's really made a dent in the oil band, this red band, because we're moving away from oil as a transportation fuel. And we're expanding our renewable energy so that those electrons that we're using to power our cars in this scenario, because we've got the carbon price, because we've done some that has had this effect of decarbonizing the electricity supply, we're ending up powering our cars with green electrons, and that is reducing our reducing the temperature by another tenth of a degree. So excellent. So that's another progress forward. And then someone on the poll was suggesting also electrification of buildings and industry. And here we can see the sort of rationale for doing that, because there's a lot of building fuel that's being used for heating things, both industrial processes and our homes. And so let's do an electrification of buildings and industry. And that's actually going to be worth 0.2 of a degree. So that was in our current scenario, that was about twice as powerful as the electrification of transport. And again, what we're seeing here is a dramatic increase in renewable energy, because we're essentially moving and a decrease in natural gas and coal. So that is basically me taking my boiler downstairs that's burning fossil gas and replacing it with an air source heat pump, which is an electric device, and then powering that electric device with green electrons. And now we're at 2.4 degrees. We're getting close to 2 degrees, folks. So we're making some real progress here. So let's see what else we can play with that you've suggested. Okay, so the next idea here is about coal. So let's this person seems like they want to just tax coal a little bit. This person seems like they want to really try to leave that coal in the ground. So what I'm going to do is let's play with that idea of really leaving the coal in the ground. And there's a lot of different ways that we can think about that. And one is that we can think about taxing coal on a kind of per ton basis. And so we can play with that type of lever. Probably what's going to happen in this picture, in this model, is that we're not going to have very much effect from that coal tax, because we're already effectively taxing coal with our carbon tax. So it's not going to incrementally do very much on top of what we've already done. But there's another lever here, which is that we can stop building new coal infrastructure. So as these emerging markets are growing their economies, what happens if we could support the growth of other alternate energy systems? It could be natural gas systems, it could be renewables, but let's just not build new coal plants in Bangladesh, Vietnam, and other places in Nigeria, where we're seeing ramp up of coal infrastructure. And so if I flip this button, this is going to be like all the banks stop investing in coal, and government financing our engines also stop investing in coal. And let's see what happens. So what we see there is the rest of the coal that we had on the board is going to decrease to 0. If we look at that air pollution picture that we were playing with before, we're going to see that that last remaining bit of air pollution that was happening from the coal system is now being decreased. And so we've again protected a lot of lungs and hearts in the process. In this situation, we didn't actually see a change in temperature. And part of the reason for that is that, again, we've already hit coal really hard with our carbon price. What I'm going to do, just for illustration, is I'm going to open up another browser tab with the model, with a sort of clean model where we don't have other interventions on the board. And let's look at just doing that aggressive stop of building new coal infrastructure. And if I pull that lever by itself, doing nothing else, and that's worth 0.3 of a degree. So it's kind of equivalent to that carbon pricing mechanism in terms of leaving that coal in the ground. And that is also going to have that similar effect on our air pollution. So just don't build more coal turns out to be a very important strategy, particularly if we don't have a carbon price, but even has some benefit if we do. So that lets us look at the coal picture here. Okay, so other ideas that we haven't tried. So someone says, let's do more nuclear energy. Nuclear energy allows us to generate electrons without carbon at the immediate point of energy generation. There is some carbon involved in extracting and refining uranium and some other ancillary support activities, but it is a zero carbon fuel in that sense. So let's subsidize nuclear energy here and see what that gets us. Okay. So what we've done is we've just subsidized nuclear energy at 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So remember that our renewable subsidy, even when we max it out, was 3 cents a kilowatt hour. We let this slider go a little farther because nuclear is more expensive. It requires more subsidy to get it going. And relative to baseline, we really have made a significant increase. So we were doing 37 exajoules before. Now we're doing 107. So we've essentially tripled global nuclear capabilities. And the temperature effect that we got from that was 0. No degrees Fahrenheit, no degrees Celsius. What's going on there? We've got a great high-tech, clean, from a carbon standpoint, clean source of fuel. Why isn't nuclear saving the day for us here? Someone want to raise their hand and offer a thought there? And I'll rewind and make the change again so you can kind of see it. What's happening here? Elizabeth, do you have a guess? You look like you were going to have to unmute, but it looked like you were going to say something. Yeah, okay. All right, we got trouble with the unmute button. That's fine. So essentially what I want you to notice is that the green band is shrinking while this teal band is increasing. So the nuclear energy is substituting away from the solar, wind, geothermal, and hydro that we've got on the board. It's not substituting away for any fossil fuels. And so therefore it doesn't have any temperature impact because, the temperature increase is driven by fossil fuels. And so unless we're leaving fossil fuels in the ground or doing something to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, we're not really moving the needle. Now, we could say, okay, well, we've done a lot of other things. So let's reset the model, go back to our sort of home position here and subsidize nuclear energy. Yes, we can get 1/10 of a degree Fahrenheit, maybe a 1/10 of a degree Celsius with a 7 cent per kilowatt hour subsidy on that nuclear. So there is a role, but again, it takes a very long time to ramp up. They're very expensive plants. And we have another source of low carbon energy that we can deploy a bit faster and cheaper. So it's not going to save the day in the way that we might think. We can even try nuclear fusion. That's what this new zero carbon tries to simulate, is the idea of a radical new source of energy. And we can put that on the board so that we have a whole new clean source of energy. But again, because in this picture, we're substituting away from renewables, it's not going to have as big of an effect as we might think. So I just got this great chat from Pedro that says, you've got 8 minutes to get to 2 degrees. So I'll pass that charge on to you. What are we going to do to get ourselves to 2 degrees? And anyone can just raise your hand and shout out, or just unmute and shout out some ideas of what haven't we tried that you think is important.
What about natural gas plants and the methane that leaks?
Okay, excellent. So let's look at the leakage of energy and industry emissions. This is the other part of the methane system that we haven't really gone after, which is that leakage across the natural gas system. And we do have some natural gas that's happening here. So let's see what that does if we do a similar kind of reduction. And that's going to get us another 1/10 of a degree. So now we've shrunk the methane a bit further. So that's an excellent point. Other ideas. What else should we try that's going to get us to 2 degrees? Alan, go ahead. Alan, sorry, you got to unmute.
Severe population control.
Okay, population. Okay, so population control. So let's look at that lever here. So we've got, as I said, the median forecast for the UN, which is 10.9 billion. We can look at this actually by region and see that most of the growth of the population is occurring in other developing countries, not China or India, which are starting to go through a demographic transition, or the US, EU, and other developed countries, which have largely gone through that transition to women per child on average. And so the changes in population are really going to be, if we look at a lower forecast. So if I pull this lever, this is actually, we can do this totally ethically. This is not Thanos snapping his fingers and killing off half the population. This is going and providing reproductive health education, providing economic opportunities for girls and women so that they have opportunities outside of family for their opportunities. And so we can reduce that. Let's see what that does. And we can get to a 9 billion future. And that in our current picture is worth another 1/10 of a degree. Now, that may be a smaller change, Alan, than you anticipated. I'd be curious to hear your reflections, whether that captures what you were hoping to see or not. It does, as I said, this actually can be a more socially just future by empowering women and girls, and it does help us. The issue here is that the population growth is largely happening in regions that are not very carbon intensive. These are not industrialized economies. So fewer people there multiplied by the emissions per person doesn't have quite the same level of impact. But it does get us a 1/10 of a degree, and we're going to celebrate every 1/10 of a degree. So thank you for that one, Alan. Any other ideas that we haven't tried? Claire, go ahead.
What about a 25% reduction in defense industry and the military complex around the world?
Okay, all right. So if we could, so world peace, we're going to pull the world peace lever. Okay. So I think that there's a couple ways we could think about trying to pull that lever. Nobody's actually ever asked me to pull that one before, but I love it. That's the Episcopalian perspective here. I think the way I'm going to model that is actually as a reduction in economic activity. So in other words, we're gonna not spend money and build a bunch of infrastructure that we otherwise would have had to build, and so we're gonna see that as there's a kind of economic growth. There's kind of growth that actually isn't economic because it's not adding total human value. We're going to try to decrease some of that. So we'll just pull off, we'll shave a couple 1/10 of a percentage point. I don't know what the total percent of GDP globally that's allocated to defense, but I think 0.2% isn't a bad guess. We could maybe,
I think like the NATO countries aim to have like 2% of their GDP, I believe.
Okay. All right. So if we actually just disintegrated all of that, and we took away a full 1%, well, even 1%. So we went outside of NATO, that 1% less economic growth from not spending on defense because we've been able to live more peacefully. I love that. That's going to give us another 1/10 of a degree. So thank you. I'm going to invoke a facilitator privilege and just point out something really interesting. Nobody talked about energy efficiency, okay? Nobody proposed that we might make our houses more energy efficient, our cars more energy efficient. And so we've left these two levers untapped. And so we're gonna bring those online. What happens if we make our cars more fuel efficient or move toward more fuel efficient modes of transport? That's gonna reduce our overall energy consumption. It's gonna make it easier to meet our needs with renewable energy. And it's going to give us a 1/10 of a degree Fahrenheit. If we make a similar kind of move on building an industry, that's going to take us across the finish line here to a 2-degree future. If I just to show what this looks like on a clean model where you're not doing anything else, if we just invest in energy efficiency and building an industry, that's worth 3/10 of a degree. Because that leaves coal, oil, and gas in the ground right now. It stops us from burning stuff. Similar order of magnitude, 2/10 of a degree from energy efficiency and transport. Didn't have as much of an effect on this picture because our carbon price was already incentivizing us to be pretty efficient, but this is what got us to 2 degrees. I want us to just take a moment, particularly in light of Claire's last addition to this picture. And I want you to consider, I want to take a moment of silence. And I want us to just consider, what would you love about getting to be part of this future? We're just going to take 30 seconds of silence to consider that. What would you love about getting to be part of this future? And I'm going to pose that as our final poll question here. What would you love about getting to be part of that future? I'm going to leave you here with sort of two poll questions. One is this one on the screen, which so we can get these out on the screen. What would you love about being part of this future? And then Pedro has pasted in a post-workshop survey to help us gather information about what you've taken away from this workshop. Interconnectedness with humanity and improved well-being. Knowing I helped my future kids and grandkids. I got ordained to help others make the world a better place. This certainly does it. The joy of being on the right side of history and leaving the world a better place than we found it for the next generation. This is a world creating a healthy and sustainable future. This is a world that I think all of us would want to create, and we all have to get into action to do it. We've reached the end of our official time. I have time to continue the conversation, continue to hang out and engage. And we can and to talk concretely about what does it look like to actually pull these levers in the real world with investments and with other forms of civic and policy action. Give a more hopeful future to those generations and being a true co-creator with God.
I do think that this is Joanne, part of the focus of ESG. I'm sorry, you're getting a phone in the background here. Is that when you mentioned the energy efficiency, particularly in the corporate world, that it is trying to drill down to the level of corporations and how are they doing water and energy efficiency to change things from the ground up.
Yeah, exactly. And what we're seeing is, so from a company perspective, we're actually seeing quite a bit of action and an accelerating level of action. So let me show a little bit about what that looks like. We're seeing companies, there's already 100, now actually 276 top companies have made a commitment to go 100% renewable. So that pulls that renewable lever and it decreases their support for fossil fuels. That's important. Science-based targets is in some ways, in my perspective, an even more ambitious level of action and challenge, which is to set targets for company emissions to actually fall along the same pace that you guys just brought global emissions towards 2 degrees. So how could we make our company's trajectory of emissions look like this same curve here on the right and follow that same ambitious level of decline? And we're seeing now 360 companies across 43 sectors representing 12 million employees are starting to make those kinds of commitments. And as you mentioned, Joanne, energy efficiency is actually the most effective way, most immediate and effective way for companies to start doing that kind of reduction, because they can invest in better processes, digitization, dematerialization, and a whole variety of so essentially smart production systems that allow them to be to optimize their energy use across their portfolio of buildings and industrial processes. So many of those companies that are achieving progress toward a science-based target are doing so through energy efficiency. And this in turn is very importantly driven by two changes in the context around companies, which all of us have a role to play in. One is the role of public policy. I mentioned before carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is starting to happen around the world. This is a map of jurisdictions that are covered by some kind of carbon price. About 20% of global emissions are covered by a carbon pricing regime, and the prices are going up. So that's something that companies see as a change in their cost structure. And then investors, investor action to drive this kind of serious commitment is ramping up very significantly. I put our own endowment, Natimco, which has been a relative laggard on climate action, very slow to the party, but they are now part of the Climate Action 100, and our new climate action plan as MIT that was just released this week has our endowment starting to take a more active role as a shareholder. Many of you may also be, as you mentioned, the Interfaith Center on Climate Change and other shareholder engagement initiatives are very important in that. There are also net zero commitments being made by asset owners and asset managers. We know through our research that many of these organizations have no idea how they're going to achieve these net zero commitments. Part of our purpose with these tools is to go and engage those investor organizations and help them understand what is the roadmap to net zero that could help us get there. But there is tremendous and very fast movement happening in the investor world on this score. And essentially what we're starting to see is that investors can invest capital, divest capital, exercise their governance powers, get involved in the political process, and that allows them to influence what happens in business, government, and civil society. And that allows us to pull some of these levers and get some of these virtuous cycles moving toward a shifted economy and society.
There has been a lot of work with the Task Force for Climate Change, TCFD, to go in and assess people's portfolios, the 2-degree initiative, the Transition Pathway Initiative. These are free online tools that people can go in and put in a company, look at your portfolio. And that's like the first step as people try and grapple with net zero, is to understand where they are coming out of the gate initially. Yes.
And there's something else in what you just said, Joanne, that's really important, which is that there's a whole family of tools and resources to help investors navigate these waters. En-ROADS is a globally aggregated model. It's not going to help you assess the climate risk in your portfolio. It's going to help orient you to what are the challenges, what are the levers that really matter, what does the world look like in a 2-degree transition scenario. But then you need to go to that, like you said, the transition pathways, the 2-degree assessment tools, and so on, to really look at, okay, which companies which sectors of my portfolio are important to engage, which companies are ahead and behind of the kind of commitments that we have to make. And so we need a kind of family of these tools and resources, and that's part of what Pedro's working on, is understanding the pathways that investors are on and where and when they can use those types of tools to make to help them take action. One thing that I'll say also is that that I think has been a really interesting debate on the MIT front. Bethany was just mentioning that our students have been active in trying to drive MIT to take action with the endowment. And there's been a very lively debate inside MIT about divestment versus engagement. And I know that within the Episcopal context, there's been some important divestment moves that have been made with tremendous symbolic value to engage others to pull capital out of these sectors. And it's very interesting, this debate, because the research suggests, the research on investor action and company response suggests that shareholder engagement is actually a more reliably effective lever to pull than divestment, particularly in public equity markets. And so some of us have actually sort of questioned this divestment idea and said, let's stay in these firms, really engage through Climate Action 100 and other campaigns to push companies to decarbonize. But there are certain moments in this journey where the commitment, the strong moral commitment to divest has a kind of an outsized political effect in the discourse around whether fossil fuel companies are legitimate and have any role to play in the context. So we've sort of come out saying that there are kind of these direct versus indirect ways that investors can have an impact on climate. Some part by what we call out with the old, so get out of the fossil fuels, reduce that risk, and some that are kind of in with the new, push capital into new things. And some ensemble of these activities is probably what is going to allow investors to both maximize their return and have the biggest impact on the decarbonizing of the economy. So there's and this is part of what we're trying to understand in research is what are these ensembles of strategies that that investors can use to move faster toward this net zero future. Other comments and questions about the tool, about the model, about climate action, about anything? We're very happy to. There's some vibrant, good Q&A going on in the chat, which I love, and really thank you, Bethany, so much for being part of that conversation.
Jason, I have one for you.
Evan, go ahead.
One that we didn't touch on when you were using the tool was the effect of planting trees.
Oh, great. Excellent.
Could you say more about that?
Totally. So afforestation is the planting of trees. So let's pull we can pull this afforestation lever. Let me open up the detailed settings so you can see what that ends up looking like. So here is, when I pull this, it's the percent of available land used for afforestation. There's a certain amount of land in the world that could be afforested because maybe it was previously deforested, or it's areas where we could actually expand forest biomes. And so if we used about 50% of the land that we could plant trees on, that is in this current picture is worth another 1/10 of a degree Fahrenheit. Fahrenheit's finer grained, so it doesn't add up to a degree Celsius. But what you can see is that that is about 3.2 gigatons, so 3.2 billion tons of carbon being removed every year. And now what you see is that this land use emissions, this green band, has gone from being above zero, meaning it's part of the faucet, to being below zero, meaning it's part of the sink that's pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And that's great. It takes a long time to secure the land, to plant the trees and have them grow. And so it's a very slow moving climate solution. There's a lot of really good reasons to plant trees in terms of creating habitat, creating storm barriers, creating microclimates that can increase rainfall, but it doesn't tend to have the impact on climate that people hope. And again, if we go back to this sort of clean model here, you can see it really vividly. If we plant trees on 100% of the land, like every tree we could plant, we plant that tree. What's happening here is that now, and we stop cutting down any trees in the world. So now we've really fully ramped up trees as our climate solution. Now what's happening is that we're putting away 6.5 gigatons a year of carbon, and that's significant. But unless we do something about the fossil fuels, it's literally 10 times that amount of emissions that we're putting into the atmosphere. So it works as a solution, and it's part of this combined approach. The other thing to just think about with some of these carbon removal solutions is how much land they take. So if we use 50% of the available land for afforestation, that just about gets us to this dotted line. And this dotted line is the land area of India. So we're planting enough trees to cover the full, just to kind of calibrate what that means. We're planting enough trees to cover the entire land area of India. And that's going to get us this 1/10 of a degree Fahrenheit. So as a climate solution, you know, it doesn't end up being as high level, but it has a lot of co-benefits, and it is a piece of the larger puzzle. Elizabeth, you got a comment?
Yeah, I haven't heard the word plastic so far in the hour, and I just wonder, it comes to mind as one of the many ways that there's so much waste, and
Yes.
what we do with the waste and how it's affecting oceans and all that.
Yes.
Can you speak to that? Like, where does it fit into this, and how much impact would it have to
Excellent.
production of plastic?
Excellent question, Elizabeth. So look, this is not a sustainability model, right? This is a climate model. So there's so many things that we wish we could capture here, from the water pollution to we are capturing air pollution, as I showed earlier. We're not capturing plastics in the ocean in this model. If we look at plastic from a pure carbon perspective, what we're doing is we're taking long chain hydrocarbons out of the ground. We're putting them through a chemical refining process that takes energy and does some emissions in the process of making the plastics. But a lot of that hydrocarbon that was in the oil or gas is ending up in an extra long hydrocarbon chain, which is the plastic molecule, right? And then we're weaving that thing together, or melting it and reforming it, and we're turning it into some kind of plastic bottle, okay? That plastic bottle has, most of the carbon that we've taken, and I don't know about the most, but you'd have to look at the math on this, but a good chunk of that carbon is now literally in the bottle. So now what happens to it at the end of life, which is your concern? Well, there's a few things I could do with it. Here in New England, we don't have landfills anymore. We don't have space for it. If I put it in the trash, it's going to an incinerator. When it's incinerated, all that carbon is going into the atmosphere. So that pathway for the plastic is going to lead to increased greenhouse gas emissions. If I were to landfill it, I'm actually just burying that sucker, and I'm leaving the hydrocarbons in the ground. It's actually like a form of carbon sequestration. So landfilling plastic isn't the worst thing for the climate, to be honest. If the plastic is ending up, getting recycled, and then I'm not having to do as much of that first processing step, then that's a little better. It still takes quite a bit of energy to melt and reform the plastic. So if you look at life cycle analysis, which is the technique for us looking at comprehensive environmental impacts, you don't get that much bang for the effort of recycling plastic as you do from recycling aluminum. Like recycling, the delta between virgin aluminum and recycled aluminum is massive. So if you recycle anything in your house, it should be the cans. Recycling plastic is marginally beneficial. We should do it. If you could just reduce the packaging, that's great, because of the emissions that are involved in making the plastic. But I actually look at plastics in the ocean as a separate environmental issue from carbon, greenhouse gas emissions, and climate change. And people tend to equate the two because it's all sort of rolled up in our minds, but it's not in this conversation because it's actually not, in this conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So Jason, as we wind down or over on our time, I wondered if you'd just like to, and Bethany, to share sort of, as you talk to our legislators, as you talk to Congress, where do you see engagement and on what kinds of topics?
Yeah,
That's Bethany question.
that's a great question. And we see, I was writing a little bit of this in the chat, but we see a ton of engagement. So what you experienced today with everybody wanting to get in on solutions is exactly what we experience, whether it's one-on-one with members of Congress or it's a group of them. It's also on both sides of the aisle, surprisingly. So we have seen a lot of engagement on the Republican side because people are looking for solutions and they just don't even know where to start. So the other thing we find is that after going through a session like this with members is they want to know more about a particular piece of information. So, methane has been really popular recently, certainly looking at renewables. There's a lot of stuff going on right now in the national level where they're digging in and seeing where they might have the biggest impact. I think the thing that we find most interesting when we're talking to Congress or members is that they feel a little bit like there's that hope piece is a little bit tough for them for a couple of reasons. One is that aligning what they want to do with what their constituents are believing is it's just tough. I mean, that's tough on any issue when you're a member, and it's even tougher on climate because it's so politicized for whatever reason. And there are a lot of people out there right now who are trying to remove it as a wedge issue, which is fabulous. And to the question about youths, there's a huge effort right now among youths that is working to remove climate as a wedge issue, and on both sides of the aisle, which I'm very hopeful about. But one of the ways we've been able to kind of move past this is that you might not be able to do all of these things in your particular district, but if you are in an area where, for instance, there's a lot of deforestation, but you also have a lot of forests, maybe that's what you focus on. Or, when I'm thinking about the church, I think, well, you might not be able to do everything here, but certainly you have a lot of big buildings and that are probably, kind of, well, at least I remember my church was pretty cold. So there might be an outsized effort or an outsized impact that you could have in certain moving certain levers. And so when we talk to members, we try to rebuild that hope through helping them understand which of the levers here they can have the most impact in their districts. And that seems to help. I think the best measurement, though, of whether or not this is effective is if they ask us to come back, and they keep asking us to come back, and they keep asking us to do more demonstrations with more members, more staff members. And that to me is really the piece that gives me the most amount of hope.
Well, as Greta Thunberg says, don't listen to me, listen to the science. So it's been fantastic to have Jason J. and MIT to share really sophisticated and right in time science with us.
I appreciate the chance to be here. There's one hand up from St. Michael's Church that I wasn't sure if there was a question you had that we didn't get a chance to address.
I just wanted to say really quick that my husband owns 2 recycling plants. And so I appreciate what you're saying about the plastics, and you were saying do the aluminum, but also I think it's really, really important for us to all remember to do cardboard and paper. Those are really the big ones, particularly because you can't make paper without paper pulp. And if you recycle paper, then you don't have to cut trees for the pulp and the paper. And mostly most paper is recycled now, but I just wanted to do a shout out for that, to really just encourage us all to recycle paper and cardboard.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that, especially in the days of Amazon where our cardboard usage is, increased by an order of magnitude.
Oh, it's crazy. Absolutely.
Yeah, we got to keep that in production. So thank you so much to all of you for your engagement digitally and so on. Please fill out that the post survey. Pedro put the link in the chat earlier. This really helps us with our research, and I'm putting the QR code up here on the screen again. If you can fill that in, that helps us understand that if there are any differences between your before and your after kind of perspective on these things. So and it helps us refine and improve our work. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Pedro and Bethany, for joining us and enlightening us today.
Cheers.
Bye-bye now.